The smell of barbecue smoke filled the crisp September air as my father stood on our back deck, beer bottle raised high above the crowd of neighbors and relatives scattered across our perfectly manicured lawn. His voice carried that familiar tone of authority that had dominated every family gathering for as long as I could remember. "To my son David," he announced, his chest swelling with pride, who just secured his promotion to lieutenant commander in Naval Public Relations. The Chen family has always produced winners, and David proves that excellence runs in our blood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The applause was immediate and thunderous. 50 guests erupted in cheers, phones appeared to capture the moment, and my brother David stood there in his crisp khaki uniform, soaking up every second of adoration like it was his birthright. Then my father's eyes found mine across the crowd. His expression shifted, became colder, more calculated. "As for Maya," he continued, his voice dropping just enough that people had to lean in to hear, "well, she's chosen a different path. We can only hope she'll come to her senses before it's too late." The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I stood there in my civilian clothes, fresh from a classified mission I couldn't discuss, watching as conversations resumed around me like I'd simply vanished into the Colorado evening air. But exactly 37 seconds later, my mother's phone buzzed with an emergency news alert that would change everything. She glanced at the screen, her face went pale, and suddenly every person at that party knew exactly who the real hero in the Chen family actually was. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across our Highlands Ranch neighborhood, turning our sprawling ranch house into something that looked more like a magazine cover than a home. This was Labor Day weekend in suburban Denver, where success was measured by square footage and the annual family barbecue was less celebration than performance. My mother Linda had spent 3 days preparing, transforming our backyard into what she called an elegant outdoor experience, complete with white string lights, cloth napkins, and a catered spread that probably cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. I arrived straight from the airport, still wearing the simple jeans and navy polo shirt I'd thrown on after changing out of my ACUs at the base. The contrast between my understated appearance and the carefully orchestrated elegance surrounding me couldn't have been more stark. Every other guest seemed to have received some unspoken memo about dress code that had somehow bypassed me entirely. The men wore pressed khakis and polo shirts in various shades of success, while the women floated around in sundresses that probably had designer labels tucked discreetly inside their collars. My father Robert commanded the center of attention near the outdoor kitchen, holding court with his usual blend of business anecdotes and thinly veiled bragging. At 62, he still carried himself like the corporate executive he'd been before retirement, every gesture calculated for maximum impact. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his casual clothes carried the kind of price tags that whispered rather than shouted, and his laugh had that practiced quality of someone who'd spent decades schmoozing clients at golf courses and private clubs. David stood beside him like a crown prince awaiting coronation. At 32, my older brother had perfected the art of looking successful without actually accomplishing anything particularly meaningful. His naval uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and insignia positioned with mathematical precision. He'd spent the last hour regaling anyone within earshot with stories about his strategic communications role at the Pentagon, carefully crafting each anecdote to sound both humble and impressive. The way he described his job, you'd think he was personally advising the Joint Chiefs on matters of national security rather than writing press releases about naval exercises and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. I made my way through the crowd, offering polite smiles and deflecting the usual questions about my little adventure in the Army. Most of our family friends had never quite understood why I'd chosen military service over the family real estate business, or at least a respectable civilian career. To them, my commission represented some kind of rebellious phase that I'd eventually outgrow, like a teenager dyeing their hair or getting a questionable tattoo. They spoke to me with the patient condescension reserved for family members who'd temporarily lost their way but would surely come to their senses eventually. My mother appeared at my elbow, her smile bright but strained in that particular way that meant she was managing multiple social calculations simultaneously. "Maya, sweetheart, you should go congratulate your brother," she whispered, her voice carrying that subtle note of instruction disguised as suggestion. "This promotion means everything to him, and you know how your father gets when he thinks you're not being supportive." I nodded and worked my way toward the center of the gathering, where David was accepting congratulations like a politician working a campaign event. He spotted me approaching, and his grin widened with what looked like genuine warmth but felt like something else entirely. "Maya, there's my little sister," he announced to the small circle surrounding him. "Still playing soldier, I see. When are you going to give up this military phase and join the grown-up world?" The laughter that followed was polite but pointed, the kind that acknowledged a joke while simultaneously reinforcing a judgment. I forced a smile and offered the expected congratulations, playing my role in the family theater that had defined so much of our relationship over the years. But even as I went through the motions, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted during my last deployment. The classified operation I'd just returned from had changed me in ways I was still processing, and standing here in this carefully orchestrated celebration of conventional success, I felt more like an observer than a participant. The irony wasn't lost on me that while David was being celebrated for his mastery of military public relations, I'd just spent 3 months actually putting my life on the line in ways that would never make it into any press release or family toast. But that was the Chen family dynamic in a nutshell. Perception mattered more than reality, and the story we told about ourselves was always more important than the truth we actually lived. The evening air carried the familiar scent of my mother's prized rose garden mixed with the smoke from our oversized gas grill, creating an atmosphere that should have felt like home but instead felt like a stage set waiting for the next act to begin. I found myself gravitating toward the edges of conversations, listening to fragments of familiar stories that had been polished through countless retellings, until they bore only a passing resemblance to actual events. This was the Chen family ecosystem in its full glory, a carefully maintained environment where success was performed rather than achieved, and where the most important battles were fought over narrative control, rather than actual accomplishments. My Uncle Richard, my father's younger brother and business partner, dominated a cluster of conversations near the outdoor bar my parents had installed last spring. At 58, Richard carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced a genuine challenge he couldn't buy his way out of. His real estate development company, Chen and Associates, had grown from a small Denver operation into a regional powerhouse over the past decade, and Richard never missed an opportunity to remind everyone within earshot of their expanding influence and growing wealth. Tonight he was regaling a captive audience with his latest acquisition story, describing how he'd outmaneuvered 3 other developers to secure prime land near the new light rail extension. The way he told it, the deal was less business transaction than military campaign, complete with strategic deception, calculated timing, and a final victory that left his competitors wondering what had hit them. The assembled neighbors and family friends hung on every word, occasionally offering the kind of appreciative murmurs that wealthy men have learned to interpret as genuine admiration. What struck me most about Richard's performance wasn't the content of his stories, but the way he told them. Every anecdote was carefully crafted to highlight his own cleverness, his superior instincts, his ability to see opportunities that lesser minds had missed. It was business as warfare, commerce as conquest, and success as a zero-sum game, where victory required someone else's defeat. Listening to him hold court, I realized he and my father shared more than just genes and business interests. They both inhabited a world where respect was something you took rather than earned, where influence was more important than integrity, and where the only stories worth telling were the ones that positioned you as the hero of your own mythology. My cousin Jennifer, Richard's daughter and David's closest ally in the ongoing family competition for parental approval, materialized beside me with 2 glasses of wine and her trademark expression of concerned superiority. At 29, Jennifer had mastered the art of delivering cutting observations disguised as caring inquiries. She'd built a successful career as a marketing director for a boutique advertising firm that specialized in luxury brands, and she approached family relationships with the same strategic mindset she brought to client campaigns. "Maya, you look tired," she said, offering me one of the wine glasses with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Military life must be so exhausting." All that structure and discipline and following orders. I don't know how you stand it. Her voice carried that particular tone of sympathy that managed to sound both genuine and condescending simultaneously, a skill she'd perfected during our childhood, when she'd learned to position herself as the responsible, mature cousin who worried about everyone else's questionable life choices. I accepted the wine and took a small sip, buying myself a moment to formulate a response that wouldn't escalate into the kind of family drama my mother spent so much energy avoiding. Jennifer had always possessed an uncanny ability to find the precise words that would sting without crossing any obvious lines, delivering emotional paper cuts with surgical precision while maintaining perfect, plausible deniability. It has its challenges, I replied, keeping my tone neutral and non-committal. But I find the work meaningful. The understatement was so massive it bordered on the absurd. My last deployment had involved coordinating intelligence operations that had prevented what could have been a catastrophic terrorist attack on American forces. But that was information I couldn't share with anyone outside my chain of command, much less a family gathering where discretion was a foreign concept, and everything eventually became fodder for social media posts. Jennifer nodded with the kind of exaggerated understanding that suggested she was already formulating her next observation. I'm sure it feels meaningful to you, but don't you ever think about the bigger picture? The opportunities you're missing? David was just telling me about the amazing networking he's doing in Washington. He's meeting senators, defense contractors, people who could really help advance his career. Meanwhile, you're stuck in some desert somewhere, taking orders from people who probably didn't even finish college. The casual dismissal in her voice was breathtaking in its completeness. In Jennifer's world, my 3 combat deployments, my advanced intelligence training, and my growing reputation within the Army's strategic planning community counted for nothing, because they didn't translate into the kind of social capital that mattered in suburban Denver dinner party. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, conversations. The fact that I'd spent the last 18 months developing counterintelligence protocols that were being implemented across multiple theaters of operation was irrelevant because it couldn't be monetized or leveraged into better cocktail party anecdotes. Across the yard, David had somehow acquired an even larger audience for his Pentagon stories. He'd positioned himself near the outdoor fireplace, using the warm glow as natural stage lighting, while he described his role in what he called strategic communications initiatives. The way he presented his work, you'd think he was personally crafting the messages that shaped global military policy, rather than editing press releases about routine training exercises and ceremonial events. What made his performance particularly galling was how effortlessly he'd appropriated the language and imagery of actual military service, while carefully avoiding any mention of the fact that his cushy Pentagon assignment had been specifically chosen to keep him as far away from real danger as possible. David had joined the Navy not out of any sense of duty or calling, but because my father had determined that military service would look good on his eventual political resume. His entire career had been carefully orchestrated to maximize visibility while minimizing risk, a calculation that had resulted in a series of assignments that sounded impressive to civilians, while ensuring he'd never actually have to face the messy realities of combat or genuine military leadership. My mother appeared at the edge of the gathering, her hostess smile firmly in place as she surveyed her domain with the satisfied expression of someone whose careful planning had achieved the desired effect. Linda Chen had spent her career as a high school English teacher before retiring early to focus on what she called family management, a role that seemed to involve treating our lives like characters in a novel she was constantly revising to achieve a more satisfying narrative arc. She caught my eye and gestured subtly toward the house, a signal I'd learned to recognize as a request for a private conversation. I excused myself from Jennifer's monologue about the limitations of military career paths and made my way through the sliding glass doors into our kitchen, where my mother was already arranging leftover appetizers with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for grading student essays. "Maya, sweetie, we need to talk," she said without looking up from her careful placement of olive skewers on a serving tray. Her voice carried that particular combination of maternal concern and strategic calculation that had defined most of our serious conversations over the past decade. "Your father and I have been discussing your situation, and we think it's time you seriously considered transitioning out of the military." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge, carefully delivered but unmistakably serious. This wasn't the first time my parents had raised the subject of my military career, but there was something different about my mother's tone tonight, something that suggested this conversation had been planned rather than spontaneous. "What situation would that be?" I asked, genuinely curious about how they'd characterized my career in their private discussions. From my perspective, my situation looked pretty good. I'd been promoted ahead of schedule, earned commendations from multiple commanding officers, and been selected for increasingly responsible assignments that suggested the Army valued my contributions and saw potential for continued advancement. My mother finally looked up from her appetizer arrangement, her expression carrying that mixture of patience and exasperation that teachers develop when dealing with students who refuse to acknowledge obvious truths. "Maya, you're 29 years old. You've proven whatever point you were trying to make when you enlisted, but now it's time to think about your future. Real future. David is building connections that will serve him for decades. Jennifer is establishing herself in a field where she can actually make a difference. Even your cousin Marcus is using his military experience as a stepping stone to bigger things." The mention of Marcus made me pause. My father's nephew had joined the Army around the same time I had, but he'd approached military service with the same strategic mindset that characterized most Chen family career decisions. Marcus had spent his 4 years building relationships, cultivating mentors, and positioning himself for maximum advantage when he eventually transitioned to the private sector. He'd recently left active duty to take a lucrative position with a defense contracting firm, a move that my extended family had celebrated as evidence of his superior planning and business acumen. Before I could formulate a response to my mother's carefully orchestrated intervention, the sound of laughter from the backyard grew louder, signaling that my father was preparing for his traditional toast. Through the kitchen window, I could see him moving toward the deck's center stage, beer bottle in hand, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you have a captive audience. This was Robert Chen's favorite moment at any family gathering, the point where he could command absolute attention and deliver the kind of speech that would be quoted and remembered long after the evening ended. "We should get back out there," my mother said, her tone suggesting this conversation was being postponed rather than concluded. "You know how your father gets when people miss his toasts." She arranged her face into the bright, supportive expression she'd perfected over decades of marriage to a man who required constant validation, and we made our way back through the sliding doors onto the deck. The crowd had naturally gravitated toward my father, forming a loose semicircle that reminded me of military briefings, except everyone was holding alcoholic beverages and wearing expressions of anticipatory pleasure rather than professional attention. My father waited for the conversations to die down, his timing honed through years of corporate presentations and family performances. He understood instinctively how to build tension, how to make people lean in, how to ensure that his words would carry maximum impact. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the yard with practiced authority, "I want to take a moment to talk about success. Real success. The kind that comes from understanding your strengths, playing to your advantages, and making strategic decisions that position you for long-term victory." His eyes found David in the crowd, and his smile broadened with unmistakable pride. "My son David has just been promoted to lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. But more importantly, he's building the kind of career that will serve him well beyond his military service." The applause was immediate and enthusiastic, exactly the response my father had orchestrated. David stepped forward slightly, not enough to appear presumptuous but sufficient to acknowledge that he was the focus of this moment. His expression carried the perfect blend of humility and confidence, the look of someone who'd learned to accept praise gracefully while secretly believing he deserved even more recognition. "David understands something that too many young people today have forgotten," my father continued, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his theme. "Success isn't just about working hard or following your passion, or any of that inspirational nonsense. Success is about making smart choices, building the right relationships, and positioning yourself where opportunity meets preparation." He raised his beer bottle higher, and the crowd mirrored his gesture with wine glasses and cocktails. To David Chen, who proves that the Chen family tradition of excellence continues to the next generation. The toast was met with cheers and applause that seemed to echo off the surrounding houses, a sound of celebration that felt both genuine and performative. I joined the applause because refusing would have created exactly the kind of scene my mother spent so much energy avoiding. But I felt disconnected from the moment, like I was watching actors perform a play I'd somehow wandered into by accident. As the immediate celebration died down, my father's gaze found me across the gathered crowd. For a split second, I thought he might include me in his remarks, perhaps offer some acknowledgement of my own military service or recent achievements. Instead, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, taking on the kind of calculated neutrality that suggested he was about to deliver a message disguised as casual observation. "Of course," he said, his tone remaining conversational but somehow carrying to every corner of the yard. "We all make different choices in life. Some of us choose paths that lead to growth and advancement, while others get distracted by idealistic pursuits that feel meaningful in the moment, but don't translate into real-world success." His eyes remained fixed on me as he spoke, and I felt the subtle shift in crowd attention that indicated everyone had understood exactly who he was talking about. The silence that followed was different from the anticipatory quiet that had preceded David's toast. This was the uncomfortable stillness that settles over a group when someone has said something that probably shouldn't have been said in public but can't be taken back. I watched faces around the crowd as people processed my father's words, some looking embarrassed by the obvious slight, others nodding slightly as if they'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to voice it themselves. My Uncle Richard broke the tension with a hearty laugh that sounded forced even to my untrained ear. "Well, Robert, you've always been one for straight talk," he said, raising his own glass in a gesture that seemed designed to move the conversation forward. "Here's to all the Chen family members, whatever paths they choose." It was a diplomatic recovery, but the damage had already been done. I felt my cheeks flush with a combination of embarrassment and anger that I tried desperately to keep from showing on my face. The casual cruelty of my father's public dismissal was breathtaking in its precision. He hadn't mentioned my name, hadn't made any direct attacks, but everyone present understood exactly what he'd communicated about my military career, my life choices, and my place in the family hierarchy. Jennifer appeared at my elbow almost instantly, her expression radiating the kind of concerned sympathy that somehow managed to make the situation worse, rather than better. "Don't take it personally, Maya," she whispered, her voice low enough that nearby conversations could continue without interruption. "You know how Uncle Robert gets when he's had a few drinks. He just wants what's best for everyone." The condescension in her attempt at comfort was almost worse than my father's original slight. Jennifer's interpretation of events suggested that my father's public dismissal was somehow evidence of his caring rather than his contempt, a reframing that required either deliberate self-deception or a level of social blindness that seemed unlikely given her professional success in reading people and situations. David, meanwhile, had smoothly transitioned into receiving individual congratulations from various family members and friends, his body language radiating the kind of satisfied confidence that comes from knowing you've been publicly validated by the person whose opinion matters most. He moved through the crowd like a politician working a campaign event, offering the perfect combination of gratitude and modesty while clearly relishing every moment of attention. What struck me most about watching him operate was how completely he'd internalized the Chen family approach to success. Everything David did was calculated for maximum social and professional advantage. From his choice of military specialty, to his careful cultivation of Pentagon connections, to his masterful performance at family gatherings like this one. He'd learned early that in our family, perception was reality, and he'd spent years crafting a public image that delivered exactly the kind of validation our father most valued. The contrast between David's triumph and my own marginalization couldn't have been more stark. While he basked in public praise for a promotion that represented another step in his carefully planned ascent through the ranks, I stood on the periphery of my own family gathering, having just returned from a classified mission that had literally saved American lives but would never be acknowledged or celebrated, because it didn't fit the narrative my family had constructed about success and achievement. I found myself thinking about the last 18 months of my military career, particularly the intensive training and operational assignments that had led to my recent deployment. The work I'd been doing in Army intelligence wasn't the kind of thing that translated well to cocktail party conversations, but it represented exactly the kind of meaningful service I'd hoped to provide when I'd first decided to enlist. I'd been developing analytical frameworks for understanding terrorist networks, creating predictive models for identifying security threats, and working with international partners to disrupt planned attacks against American interests. The mission I'd just returned from had been the culmination of 2 years of intelligence gathering and operational planning. My team had identified a sophisticated network of insurgents who were planning coordinated attacks on 3 different American bases across 2 countries. The intelligence work required to uncover their plans had been painstaking and dangerous, involving months of careful analysis, covert surveillance, and eventually direct action that had neutralized the threat before it could be executed. The operation's success had earned commendations from multiple levels of command, and my role in developing the analytical approach that had made the mission possible had been specifically noted in after-action reports that would influence future counterintelligence protocols. In terms of actual impact on American security and military effectiveness, my recent work represented exactly the kind of achievement that should have made any family proud. But standing here in my parents' backyard, listening to my father celebrate David's latest public relations success while dismissing my own career as idealistic distraction, I realized that none of my actual accomplishments mattered, because they couldn't be converted into the currency my family valued most: social status, financial advancement, and public recognition that enhanced the Chen family brand. The evening air had grown cooler as the sun disappeared behind the Rocky Mountains, and someone had switched on the string lights that transformed our backyard into the kind of Instagram-worthy setting my mother had spent so much time and money creating. The warm glow cast everything in a golden light that should have felt magical but instead felt artificial, like a movie set designed to create the illusion of family harmony while hiding the tensions and calculations that actually drove our relationships. I excused myself from Jennifer's continued attempts at consolation and made my way toward the house, ostensibly to use the bathroom but actually to escape the suffocating atmosphere of performed happiness and strategic socializing that defined every Chen family gathering. As I walked past clusters of conversations, I caught fragments of discussion about David's promotion, my father's business successes, and Jennifer's latest marketing campaigns, but nothing about military service that didn't involve either David's Pentagon networking or Marcus's successful transition to the private sector. Inside the house, I found myself standing in our formal living room, a space my mother had decorated with the kind of expensive furniture and carefully curated artwork that was designed to impress visitors while remaining completely impractical for actual living. The room felt like a museum exhibit about successful suburban families, complete with family photos that had been professionally shot and strategically placed to tell the story my parents wanted to project about their achievements and their children's accomplishments. What struck me most about examining those photos was how comprehensively they documented David's journey through childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood, while containing almost no visual evidence of my own existence. There were pictures of David's high school graduation, his Naval Academy acceptance, his commissioning ceremony, and various family celebrations of his military and academic achievements. My own military career was represented by a single photograph from my basic training graduation, tucked into a corner where it would be visible to anyone who looked carefully but wouldn't dominate the visual narrative my parents had constructed about their family's success story. The sound of my mother's phone buzzing on the kitchen counter pulled me from my examination of our family's photographic mythology. She'd left it charging near the window, and I could see the screen lighting up repeatedly with what appeared to be some kind of emergency alert system. The distinctive sound pattern suggested breaking news rather than a personal message, the kind of urgent notification that usually meant something significant was happening in the world beyond our carefully controlled suburban bubble. I walked over to check what was causing the commotion, assuming it might be weather-related, or perhaps some local emergency that could affect the evening's festivities. The screen showed multiple notifications from news apps, social media platforms, and emergency alert systems, all time-stamped within the past few minutes. The preview text I could see without unlocking the phone contained fragments that made my heart rate spike. Pentagon announces, Captain Maya Chen, and classified operation. My hands started shaking as I realized what was unfolding. The mission I'd just returned from, the one I'd assumed would remain classified for years if not decades, was apparently being declassified and released to the media. This wasn't supposed to happen. The operational security protocols around intelligence missions like ours typically meant that details remained classified for extended periods, if they were ever released at all. The fact that my name was appearing in breaking news alerts suggested something had gone very wrong with normal procedures, or something had gone very right in ways I hadn't anticipated. Through the kitchen window, I could see that several other party guests were checking their phones, their expressions shifting from casual interest to focused attention as they processed whatever information they were receiving. The body language across the backyard was changing, conversations becoming more intense, people gathering in smaller clusters as they shared whatever news they were discovering. My mother appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face flushed with excitement and confusion. "Maya, what's happening? People are getting news alerts about you. Something about Afghanistan and a terrorist attack, and the Pentagon making an announcement." Her voice carried the kind of breathless urgency that suggested she was processing information faster than she could fully understand it. Before I could respond, my father's voice boomed from the backyard, calling everyone's attention with the same commanding tone he'd used for his toast just minutes earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. It appears we have some breaking news that affects our family directly." The excitement in his voice was unmistakable, but there was also something else, a note of uncertainty that suggested he was as surprised by whatever was developing as everyone else. We moved back outside to find that someone had connected their phone to the outdoor speaker system and was preparing to play what appeared to be a live news broadcast. The crowd had reformed into the same semicircle that had witnessed David's celebration, but the energy was completely different now. Instead of the controlled anticipation that had preceded my father's planned toast, there was genuine suspense in the air, the kind of electric tension that comes from knowing something significant is about to be revealed, but having no control over what that revelation might contain. The news anchor's voice filled the evening air with professional gravity. "Good evening. We're interrupting our regular programming to bring you breaking news from the Pentagon. Defense Secretary Patricia Williams has just announced the declassification of details surrounding a counterintelligence operation in Afghanistan that prevented what officials are calling one of the most sophisticated terrorist attacks ever planned against American forces in the region." I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized this was really happening. The operation I'd spent months planning and executing, the mission that had consumed every waking moment of my deployment, was about to be described in detail to a national television audience that included my entire extended family. The professional distance I'd maintained between my military and civilian lives was about to collapse completely. The operation, designated Iron Shield, was conceived and executed by a team led by Captain Chen of Army Intelligence. The anchor continued, and I watched 50 faces turn toward me with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something that might have been recognition. Captain Chen's innovative analytical approach identified a network of insurgents who had infiltrated multiple Afghan security agencies and were planning coordinated attacks on 3 American bases that could have resulted in hundreds of casualties. The silence in our backyard was absolute. Not even the ambient sounds of suburban evenings seemed to penetrate the bubble of stunned attention that had settled over the gathering. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears as the news report continued, describing in clinical detail the intelligence work, operational planning, and tactical execution that had consumed the last 2 years of my life. The complexity of the planned attack was unprecedented, the anchor explained. The terrorist network had spent 18 months placing operatives in positions where they could coordinate simultaneous strikes using insider knowledge of base security protocols, personnel schedules, and defensive capabilities. Only Captain Chen's breakthrough analysis of communication patterns between seemingly unrelated incidents allowed American forces to identify and neutralize the threat before it could be executed. My father's face was a study in cognitive dissonance. The man who had just dismissed my military career as idealistic distraction was now hearing a Pentagon spokesman describe my work as exceptional service that exemplifies the highest standards of American military intelligence. His expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked like the beginning of recalculation as he processed information that didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed about my life choices. David had gone completely still, his earlier confidence replaced by something that looked like shock mixed with calculation. The brother who had spent the evening regaling everyone with stories about his Pentagon networking was now listening to actual Pentagon officials praise intelligence work that made his public relations achievements seem insignificant by comparison. I could practically see him trying to figure out how this development affected his own carefully cultivated image as the family's military success story. Captain Chen's work didn't just prevent a catastrophic loss of American lives, the Pentagon spokesman continued through the speaker system. Her analytical methods are being incorporated into counterintelligence protocols across multiple theaters of operation. The techniques she developed for identifying sophisticated terrorist networks will influence American military intelligence operations for years to come. Jennifer was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that combined surprise with what might have been respect, or possibly just recalculation of social dynamics she'd thought she understood. The cousin who had spent years positioning herself as the family's voice of practical wisdom was now confronting evidence that my supposedly impractical military career had produced achievements that dwarfed anything she'd accomplished in her marketing campaigns for luxury brands. The news report continued with additional details about the operation's complexity and success, but I found myself focusing more on the faces around me than on the words coming through the speakers. The cognitive dissonance was visible everywhere I looked. These were people who had spent years treating my military service as a phase I'd eventually outgrow, a distraction from more serious career pursuits. Evidence of idealistic thinking that hadn't been tempered by practical considerations. Now they were hearing Pentagon officials describe my work in terms typically reserved for the kind of military heroes who get movies made about their exploits. The disconnect between their assumptions about my life and the reality being broadcast to the nation was creating a kind of social vertigo that I could see playing out in real time across 50 different faces. My Uncle Richard was perhaps the most visibly affected by the revelations. The man who had spent the evening describing his real estate deals in military terminology, as if commercial negotiations were equivalent to actual combat, was now hearing about actual military operations that had prevented genuine catastrophe. His earlier performance as a strategic mastermind seemed embarrassingly trivial in comparison to what was being described about my work. The news segment concluded with an announcement that Captain Maya Chen would be receiving the Distinguished Intelligence Cross, one of the highest honors awarded for exceptional service in military intelligence operations. The anchor noted that the award ceremony would take place at the Pentagon in 2 weeks, with Defense Secretary Williams personally presenting the decoration in recognition of service that had, quote, prevented catastrophic loss of American lives through innovative intelligence analysis and exceptional operational leadership. As the broadcast ended and someone disconnected the audio feed, the silence that settled over our backyard felt different from any quiet I'd ever experienced at a family gathering. This wasn't the comfortable pause between conversations or the respectful attention that preceded toasts. This was the stunned silence of people whose fundamental assumptions about reality had just been challenged by information they couldn't dismiss or rationalize away. I found myself in the surreal position of being the center of attention at a Chen family gathering, for reasons that had nothing to do with my parents' carefully orchestrated social performance. For the first time in my adult life, I was being recognized not as the family member who had made questionable life choices, but as someone who had achieved something genuinely significant in terms that even the most status-conscious relatives couldn't diminish or reframe. The irony was overwhelming. Just 30 minutes earlier, my father had publicly dismissed my military career as idealistic distraction that didn't translate into real-world success. Now the same career was being celebrated on national television as exemplary service that had saved American lives and would influence military operations for years to come. The man who had toasted David's promotion to lieutenant commander was now confronting the reality that his daughter had achieved something that would never fit on a resume, because it was too classified, too significant, and too far beyond the realm of conventional success metrics. But perhaps the most striking aspect of the moment wasn't the recognition itself, but the way it highlighted how completely my family had misunderstood not just my career, but my character and capabilities. They had constructed a narrative about my life based on their own assumptions about what constituted meaningful achievement, never bothering to investigate whether their assumptions aligned with reality. The result was a gap between perception and truth so vast that it took a Pentagon news conference to bridge it. I looked around at the faces staring at me and realized that while the news had vindicated my career choices and achievements, it hadn't necessarily changed the fundamental dynamics that had created the misunderstanding in the first place. The same people who had dismissed my work when they thought it was insignificant might now try to claim credit for supporting me, or rewrite history to position themselves as having always recognized my potential. The Chen family's relationship with truth was complicated enough that even objective validation might not produce the kind of authentic recognition I'd always hoped to receive. My father was the first to break the silence, and his approach was exactly what I should have expected. Instead of acknowledging his earlier dismissal or offering any form of apology, he immediately began repositioning himself as having always been supportive of my military service. "Well," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority mixed with something that might have been nervous energy, "I always knew Maya had exceptional analytical capabilities. It's no surprise to me that the Pentagon has finally recognized what we've always known about her potential." The audacity of his revisionist history was breathtaking. Less than an hour earlier, he had publicly characterized my military career as a distraction from more meaningful pursuits, using language that left no doubt about his actual opinion of my life choices. Now he was claiming prescient recognition of abilities he'd never acknowledged, and achievements he'd consistently minimized. It was a masterclass in narrative control, the kind of strategic repositioning that had made him successful in business but felt like a betrayal when applied to family relationships. David's response was more subtle but equally calculated. Rather than compete directly with the attention I was suddenly receiving, he pivoted to positioning himself as having insider knowledge about Pentagon operations that had given him special insight into the significance of my work. "I've been hearing rumors about classified operations for months," he said to the cluster of relatives surrounding him, "but obviously I couldn't discuss anything due to security protocols. The public affairs side of military operations gives you a unique perspective on what's really happening behind the scenes." It was a brilliant tactical maneuver that allowed him to maintain his status as the family's military expert, while creating the impression that he'd been aware of my achievements all along. The fact that his Pentagon assignment had absolutely no connection to Army intelligence operations or classified counterterrorism missions was a detail he glossed over with the kind of confident vagueness that had always been his specialty. Jennifer's recalibration was perhaps the most transparent. Within minutes of the news broadcast ending, she had transformed from the concerned cousin who worried about my impractical career choices into my biggest supporter and advocate. "I've always admired Maya's dedication to service," she announced to anyone within earshot, "even when I didn't fully understand the scope of what she was accomplishing. It takes real courage to pursue meaningful work, even when other people don't immediately recognize its value." The speed with which she rewrote our relationship's history was impressive in its shamelessness. Jennifer had spent years positioning herself as the voice of practical wisdom in our generation, consistently suggesting that my military service represented a failure to understand how the real world worked. Now she was claiming to have been a secret admirer of my courage and dedication, conveniently forgetting every conversation in which she'd encouraged me to consider more conventional career paths. But it was my mother's reaction that proved most illuminating. Rather than joining the general rush to reframe everyone's relationship with my military career, she seemed genuinely stunned by the gap between what she thought she knew about my life and what was being revealed through the news coverage. Linda Chen had always prided herself on being the family member who understood everyone's emotional landscape, the person who could read between the lines and intuit what people really needed even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. "Maya," she said, approaching me with an expression that combined wonder with something that looked like regret, "why didn't you ever tell us about any of this? We had no idea you were working on anything so important, so dangerous. When you said you were doing intelligence work, we thought you meant analyzing reports and writing briefings, not preventing terrorist attacks." Her question revealed the fundamental disconnect that had shaped our family's understanding of my military service. My parents had constructed their own version of what my career entailed based on their assumptions about what intelligence work looked like, never bothering to ask for details or showing genuine curiosity about the actual nature of my assignments. They had been content to categorize my work as desk duty with a fancy title, allowing them to dismiss it as less significant than David's more visible Pentagon role. The truth was that I had tried to share more about my work on multiple occasions, but every attempt had been met with polite disinterest or gentle redirection toward topics my family found more engaging. When I'd mentioned specialized training programs, they'd assumed I was talking about routine military education. When I'd referenced deployment preparations, they'd focused on the inconvenience to family gatherings rather than the significance of the missions I was preparing for. When I'd tried to explain the complexity of counterintelligence operations, their eyes had glazed over with the kind of polite boredom that suggested they were waiting for me to finish so the conversation could move on to more interesting subjects. The pattern had been so consistent that I'd eventually stopped trying to bridge the gap between my military life and my family relationships. It had seemed easier to compartmentalize completely, keeping the most meaningful aspects of my career separate from family interactions that were increasingly focused on David's achievements and my supposed failure to pursue more conventional success. Now, standing in our backyard while 50 relatives and family friends processed the reality of what I'd actually been accomplishing during my supposed phase of idealistic distraction, I realized that the vindication I was experiencing felt more hollow than triumphant. The recognition was gratifying, but it came from strangers at the Pentagon rather than the people whose opinions had shaped my understanding of my own worth for most of my adult life. Over the next several hours, as the party gradually transitioned from a celebration of David's promotion to an impromptu recognition ceremony for my unexpected national recognition, I watched my family's social dynamics reorganize themselves around this new information. The relatives who had spent years treating me as the family member who had made questionable life choices suddenly wanted to hear stories about my military experiences. The neighbors who had politely tolerated my presence at community gatherings were now eager to discuss my insights about national security and international relations. Uncle Richard, who had dominated earlier conversations with his real estate war stories, now positioned himself as having always respected military service and understanding the sacrifices required for national defense. The man who had spent decades treating business negotiations as the highest form of strategic thinking was suddenly full of praise for people who put their lives on the line for causes larger than profit margins. The transformation was so complete and so rapid that it felt like watching a theatrical performance where all the actors had suddenly switched roles mid-scene. The same people who had been celebrating David's mastery of Pentagon networking were now praising my commitment to actual military operations. The relatives who had encouraged me to consider transitioning to more practical career paths were now expressing pride in my dedication to service over personal advancement. But perhaps the most significant shift was in how my parents began talking about their children's respective military careers. Throughout David's rise through the Navy ranks, they had consistently presented his service as evidence of the Chen family's commitment to public service and national defense. His Pentagon assignment had been described as proof of his exceptional capabilities and the respect he commanded among senior military leadership. Now they were discovering that while David had been building relationships and managing public relations campaigns, I had been developing capabilities that senior military leadership considered exceptional enough to influence future operations across multiple theaters. The contrast between their assumptions about our respective contributions to military effectiveness and the reality being revealed through Pentagon recognition was forcing a fundamental recalibration of family narratives that had been years in the making. My father's attempts to process this new information were particularly fascinating to observe. As someone who had built his identity around being able to assess people's capabilities and potential, he was confronting evidence that his judgment about his own daughter had been spectacularly wrong. The military career he had dismissed as impractical idealism was being celebrated by Defense Department officials as exemplary service that demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking and operational excellence he claimed to value most. The cognitive dissonance was visible in his attempts to explain how he had always recognized my potential, while simultaneously maintaining that his earlier criticism had been motivated by concern for my future prospects. He seemed to be struggling with the realization that his assessment of what constituted meaningful achievement had been based on incomplete information and assumptions that were proving to be fundamentally flawed. David's response to the evening's developments was more complex and, in some ways, more honest than our parents' immediate revisionism. Rather than pretending he had always understood the significance of my work, he seemed genuinely surprised by the gap between what he thought he knew about military intelligence operations and what was being revealed about my actual contributions. His Pentagon experience had apparently given him enough familiarity with classified operations to understand that what I had accomplished was genuinely exceptional, even by military standards. "Maya," he said during a quiet moment when we found ourselves standing together near the edge of the deck, "I had no idea you were working on anything like this. When you talked about intelligence analysis, I thought you meant something completely different. The stuff they're describing on the news, that's not routine military work. That's the kind of operation that gets people promoted to general officer ranks." His acknowledgement felt more genuine than the broader family celebration that was unfolding around us. David understood military hierarchies and recognition systems well enough to recognize that Pentagon announcements about individual officers were extremely rare, and that the language being used to describe my work indicated achievements that went far beyond routine service. His surprise seemed authentic rather than performed, and his questions about my experiences felt like genuine curiosity rather than strategic positioning. As the evening progressed and more details about Operation Iron Shield became available through additional news coverage, the full scope of what I had accomplished became clearer to everyone present. The terrorist network I had identified and disrupted had been planning coordinated attacks that could have resulted in hundreds of American casualties and fundamentally altered the strategic situation in Afghanistan. The analytical methods I had developed were being incorporated into training programs for intelligence officers across multiple agencies, and the operational success was being studied as a model for future counterterrorism efforts. The recognition from senior Pentagon officials continued to expand throughout the evening as additional statements were released to the media. Defense Secretary Williams issued a formal commendation describing my work as representing the highest standards of military intelligence operations and noting that the techniques I had developed would influence American counterterrorism efforts for years to come. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff released a statement calling my analytical breakthrough a significant contribution to military effectiveness that demonstrated exceptional service worthy of national recognition. By the time the evening was winding down and guests were beginning to leave, the entire character of what had been planned as David's celebration had been transformed. Instead of a family gathering focused on his promotion and future prospects, it had become an impromptu recognition ceremony for military achievements that none of us had anticipated would ever become public knowledge. The conversations that had begun with discussions of David's Pentagon networking were ending with requests for my insights about national security challenges and international terrorism. The relatives who had spent years encouraging me to consider more conventional career paths were now expressing pride in my commitment to service that had produced tangible results in terms of American lives saved and military effectiveness enhanced. But despite the recognition and validation I was receiving, I found myself feeling oddly detached from the celebration. The vindication was gratifying, but it came from external sources, rather than from the people whose opinions had shaped my understanding of my own worth. My family's sudden recognition of my achievements felt more like strategic repositioning than genuine acknowledgement of capabilities they had consistently overlooked or dismissed. The evening ended with my father proposing a toast to both of his children's military service, carefully positioning himself as having always been proud of our respective contributions to national defense. The speech was masterfully crafted to suggest continuous support and recognition, while avoiding any acknowledgement of his earlier dismissal of my career choices. It was exactly the kind of narrative control that had made him successful in business, but it felt like revisionist history when applied to family relationships. As I drove home that night, I found myself thinking about the complex emotions that had characterized the entire experience. The public recognition of my military achievements was deeply satisfying, but it had come at the cost of any illusion that my family's understanding of my life was based on genuine interest or accurate information. They had been content to categorize my work based on their assumptions, rather than seeking to understand what I was actually accomplishing, and their sudden celebration felt more like social adaptation than authentic recognition. The Pentagon would name a building after me 6 months later, honoring my contributions to military intelligence operations and the analytical methods that had become standard practice across multiple agencies. But the recognition that mattered most, the acknowledgement from family members whose opinions had shaped my understanding of my own worth, would always be complicated by the knowledge that it had required external validation to produce. The true lesson of that evening wasn't about military achievement or family dynamics, but about the importance of building self-worth based on authentic accomplishment rather than external recognition. The work I had done in Afghanistan had been meaningful, regardless of whether my family understood its significance, and my commitment to service had been valuable independent of their ability to recognize its worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.